After discovering a $1 million corruption scheme, he becomes a target. But the only witness to what he saw is unlikely. A stray dog that no one noticed. Now, the truth depends on him, and the unexpected fate that awaits them. Welcome to the channel. Before we begin, like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this one. The sky over Chicago dawned heavy on that autumn morning. Gray clouds hung over the city as if carrying the weight of secrets that were about to come to light. At Trans Am, the largest transportation company in Illinois, employees were starting another workday, oblivious to the storm forming beyond the windows of the imposing administrative building. Robert Silver, 42, logistics supervisor, looked at the pile of documents on his desk as if staring into an abyss. After 3 years working at the company, he never imagined he would discover something so serious. He ran his hands through his graying hair at the temples, more the result of accumulated stress than age, and took a deep breath. The financial spreadsheets, invoices, and contracts he had gathered over the past few months formed a devastating puzzle, a fraud scheme that was diverting millions from the company's coffers. Across the hall, in a room with a privileged view of Lake Michigan, Mark Matthews, Trans Am's financial director, was speaking on the phone in an agitated tone. At 50, Mark was known for his explosive temper and for running the company with an iron fist. "I don't care how you solve this. I want those documents on my desk today, understood?" he vociferated, hanging up the phone forcefully. His secretary, Julie Parker, knocked lightly on the half-open door. "Mr. Matthews, Robert is out here. He says he needs to speak with you urgently." Mark adjusted his navy blue tie and smoothed his impeccable suit. "Send him in." Robert entered the room with a manila envelope in his hands. His heart was beating hard against his chest, but he was determined. "Good morning, Mark. We need to talk about something serious." "Be brief, I have a meeting in 15 minutes, replied Mark, without taking his eyes off the computer. "I found irregularities in the company's accounts. Systematic diversions, fake invoices, ghost contracts." Robert placed the envelope on the desk. "It's all documented here." Mark's expression changed instantly. His eyes narrowed, and a tense silence filled the room. "You've been poking around where you shouldn't, Robert," he finally said, his voice dangerously calm. "Do you know what happens to people who meddle in matters that don't concern them?" "This concerns all Trans Am employees," Robert retorted, feeling his throat dry. "I'm going to take this information to the board of directors." Mark let out a dry laugh. "You really think they don't know? Why do you think Trans Am has grown so much in recent years?" Robert's world seemed to collapse. It wasn't just Mark. The scheme involved the company's top leadership. "We can solve this another way," continued Mark, opening a drawer. "There's $200,000 in here. It's yours if you forget what you saw." Robert stared at the wad of money and then at the envelope with the evidence. "I'm not for sale, Mark." The financial director slammed his fist on the desk. "Think about your family, about Sarah, about your son in college." "I am thinking about them. What example would I set by accepting dirty money?" Mark rose abruptly. "Let's talk somewhere else. On the bridge to the parking lot. No cameras, no witnesses." Robert hesitated but followed his boss. He knew he was taking a risk, but he needed to buy time to decide how to proceed. The envelope with the evidence remained on Mark's desk. The bridge connecting the administrative building to the parking lot was a concrete structure that passed over a branch of the Chicago River. Below, the dark and turbulent waters reflected the stormy sky. Employees and cars passed by hurriedly, trying to avoid the imminent rain. "Last chance, Robert," said Mark, shaking the envelope he had brought with him. $200,000 and you keep your job. Refuse, and not only will you be fired, but you'll never work anywhere in this state again. You don't understand, do you? This isn't about money." "It's always about money," shouted Mark, advancing toward Robert. The two men grappled. Mark grabbed Robert by the collar of his shirt, pushing him against the parapet of the bridge. Robert, stronger and taller, tried to defend himself without hurting his boss. Employees passing by stopped, horrified at the scene. "Help, they're fighting!" shouted a woman. Amid the confusion, Mark tripped on his own foot and lost his balance. Feeling that he was going to fall, he desperately grabbed onto Robert's jacket, who tried to hold him. The envelope slipped from Mark's hands, and in an instinctive move, he pushed it into the waters before plummeting from the bridge. The impact was heard by everyone. Screams of horror echoed as Mark disappeared beneath the turbulent waters of the river. Robert, stunned, looked down, unable to believe what had just happened. He pushed the boss, someone shouted. In seconds, security guards surrounded Robert, who offered no resistance. He was in shock, repeating, "I didn't push him. He tripped. I tried to hold him." In the distance, sirens announced the arrival of the police. The rain began to fall, first in sparse drops, then in a merciless downpour. Employees ran to the riverbank, trying to locate Mark in the increasingly turbulent waters. That's when something unexpected happened. A strong bark cut through the air. A medium-sized black stray dog, known to all as Guardian, the ghost of the bridge, came running. The animal was a familiar figure in the area, always solitary, always vigilant, as if guarding some secret of the city. Without hesitation, it plunged into the turbulent waters. The waters of the Chicago River, normally calm, were turbulent that morning because of the heavy rain falling over the city. Trans Am employees watched in terror as the scene unfolded. Guardian, the stray dog known to all, was swimming determinedly toward the spot where Mark had disappeared. "Look, Guardian is trying to save him," shouted Julie, the secretary, pointing to the animal that was struggling against the current. A few meters away, Mark reappeared on the surface, coughing and flailing, clearly without the strength to fight against the force of the waters. His soaked suit was weighing him down, and panic was visible on his pale face. Guardian swam with an almost human determination. When he finally reached Mark, he grabbed the executive's jacket with his teeth and began pulling him toward the shore. The crowd on the bridge watched the unlikely rescue, holding their breath. "The firefighters are coming," announced one of the security guards over the radio as sirens approached ever closer. On the bridge, Robert remained detained by the company's security guards, his face wet from the rain mixed with tears of despair. "It was an accident," he repeated as he watched the rescue. "I tried to hold him, I swear to God I tried." A team of firefighters quickly arrived at the scene. Two of them descended to the shore with ropes and rescue equipment, while a third coordinated the operation from the top of the bridge. "There's a dog helping the victim. Incredible!" shouted one of the firefighters over the radio. When Mark and Guardian finally reached the shallower area, the firefighters entered the water to help. Mark was pulled to shore, coughing and shaking, while Guardian remained by his side, panting, as if ensuring that the man was truly safe. "Are you okay? Sir, can you hear me?" asked one of the firefighters, checking Mark's vital signs. "The documents," muttered Mark, before being placed on the stretcher by the paramedics, who had arrived shortly after the firefighters. Guardian, after making sure that Mark was being attended to, shook the water from his fur and, to everyone's surprise, plunged back into the river. "What is that dog doing?" asked one of the firefighters, perplexed. A few minutes later, Guardian emerged again, but this time he had something between his teeth, the soaked envelope that Mark had thrown into the water. At the same moment, the police arrived at the bridge and began to disperse the crowd of onlookers that had formed. Robert was taken to give a statement, insisting that it had all been an accident during a heated discussion. "He threw the envelope into the water before falling," explained Robert to Detective Thomas Anderson at the Central Police Station in Chicago. "That envelope contains evidence of a fraud scheme at Trans Am, a scheme that Mark himself coordinates." The detective, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a skeptical expression, observed Robert carefully. "You're saying that your boss, who almost lost his life today, is involved in fraud, and that you, coincidentally, discovered this just before he fell from the bridge during an argument with you. It wasn't a coincidence. I've been gathering this evidence for months," Robert shot back, "and I didn't push him. We had an argument. He tripped and fell. I tried to hold him, but I couldn't. Witnesses say they saw you fighting. We were arguing. He offered me money to keep quiet about the fraud." The detective made notes in his notebook. "And this envelope that he supposedly threw into the river, where is it now?" I don't know, it was probably carried away by the current. At that moment, a policewoman entered the room with a plastic bag containing the soaked envelope. Detective, this was delivered to the front desk. A reporter from the Chicago Tribune said a dog left it at the door of the newsroom before disappearing. Detective Anderson looked incredulously at the envelope, then at Robert, whose expression of surprise seemed genuine. What's this story? About a dog? It must be Guardian, explained Robert. He's a stray that lives around the company. He's the one who saved Mark. And now this dog is delivering evidence of fraud. This sounds like the plot of a Mexican soap opera, Mr. Silva. Meanwhile, at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Mark Matthews was receiving treatment. Besides mild hypothermia, he had suffered some cuts and bruises in the fall. In the waiting room, Mark's wife, Claire Matthews, an elegant 45-year-old woman, was waiting for news. Next to her, nervous, was Helen Carter, 35, Trans Am's lawyer, and secretly Mark's lover for the past 2 years. How did this happen, Helen? Mark was always so careful, whispered Claire, holding a tissue paper between her trembling fingers. Helen adjusted her expensive framed glasses on her face and ran her hand through her brown hair, impeccably groomed even in that emergency situation. It was an accident, Claire. Robert and he were talking on the bridge when Mark tripped. Talking, that's not what I was told. They said they were fighting. Those are just rumors, cut off Helen, fearing that the situation would get out of control. If the documents had indeed been recovered, as she had heard from the police officers in the hallway, they were all in trouble. The doctor appeared in the waiting room. Mrs. Matthews, your husband is stable now. He had a minor trauma, but he'll be fine. He's asking to speak with the company lawyer urgently. Helen and Claire exchanged glances. The lawyer followed the doctor to the room where Mark was. Helen, he called as soon as he saw her. We need to act quickly. The envelope. Calm down, Mark. You're in the hospital. You need to rest. You don't understand. That dog got... The envelope. Where is it now? The police found a wet envelope that was delivered to the Chicago Tribune newsroom. They're analyzing the contents. Mark's face, already pale, turned almost transparent. We're finished, all of us. Helen sat on the edge of the bed and held his hand. Not yet. I have a plan. We'll blame Robert for everything. We'll say he created false documents to incriminate us after we discovered that he was the one embezzling money from the company. That won't work. The board... Leave the board to me, interrupted Helen. I have enough contacts to ensure that the official version is ours. We need to act quickly before that dog appears with something else. Meanwhile, in a simple house in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, Sarah Silva, 38, Robert's wife, was receiving the news of what had happened. By her side was her son Lucas, 19, an engineering student at the University of Chicago. Mom, it's impossible that Dad tried to hurt someone, said Lucas, upset. He's the most upright person I know. Sarah, a teacher in the state school system, tried to remain calm, but her desperation was visible. I'm going to call Mr. Paul. He's a criminal lawyer. He'll help us. A noise at the door interrupted the conversation. When Sarah opened it, there was no one there, just Guardian, the black stray dog, sitting on the doorstep with another envelope between his teeth. Lucas, it's the dog from your dad's company. Lucas carefully took the envelope. Inside was a flash drive and a handwritten note. Backup copies. Use wisely. Sarah and Lucas looked at each other, perplexed, as Guardian disappeared into the rainy Chicago night, like a shadow fleeing from the light. The rain falling over Chicago intensified during the night, as if the sky were crying for the injustice unfolding. In the small interrogation room at the Central Police Station, Robert Silva continued his testimony, exhausted after hours of answering the same questions. Mr. Silva, for the last time, what exactly was your relationship with Mark Matthews? Asked Detective Anderson, leafing through a folder with documents. Purely professional. He has been my direct superior for 3 years, replied Robert, rubbing his tired eyes. And when did you begin to suspect the illegal activities in the company? About 6 months ago, when I noticed inconsistencies in transportation contracts for the northern parts of the country. Inflated values, shell companies listed as partners. A young police officer entered the room and whispered something in the detective's ear, who nodded with a serious expression. "Mr. Silver, it seems we have an interesting situation. The technical team has preliminarily analyzed the documents from the envelope, and indeed there are strong indications of fraud at Transam." Robert let out a sigh of relief. "That's what I've been trying to say from the beginning. However," continued the detective, "this doesn't prove that you didn't try to assault your boss on the bridge. The witnesses were clear about the physical confrontation." At that moment, the door to the room opened, and attorney Paul Mitchell entered, accompanied by Sarah and Lucas. "Detective Anderson, I'm Mr. Silver's attorney. I'd like to speak with my client alone, if possible." The detective hesitated but agreed. 5 minutes. When they were alone, Mr. Mitchell approached Robert. "We have something that could change everything," he said, as Lucas took the flash drive from his pocket. "Where did you get this?" asked Robert, surprised. "You won't believe it, but Guardian showed up at home with this envelope," explained Sarah. "Inside was this flash drive with a note saying they were backup copies." Robert took the device, impressed with the unfolding of events. "That dog, it seems like he's trying to help." "I've already analyzed the contents," said Lucas. "There are spreadsheets, contracts, emails, everything you gathered over the past few months, plus some things you hadn't seen before, including recordings of meetings between Mark and other directors." "How is this possible?" inquired Robert. "I don't know, Dad, but this Guardian seems more than just a simple stray dog." When the detective returned, Mr. Mitchell took the floor. "Detective, we have new evidence that not only corroborates my client's version about the fraud at Transam, but also clarifies the incident on the bridge. With authorization, Lucas connected the flash drive to a computer at the police station. One of the recordings clearly showed the discussion on the bridge, captured by a security camera that wasn't in the company's official records. In it, Mark could be seen tripping and, as he fell, holding on to Robert, who tried in vain to prevent the fall. "This changes everything," commented the detective, impressed. "Where did this recording come from?" "We believe someone inside the company is helping," replied Mr. Mitchell, avoiding mentioning the dog to avoid further complicating the situation. Meanwhile, at the Matthews mansion in the Gold Coast neighborhood, an emergency meeting was taking place. Besides Helen and Claire, 3 Transam directors were present: Richard Turner, Operations; Sandra Vance, Marketing; and Edward Baker, Human Resources. "The situation is extremely serious," announced Helen, standing in front of the lit fireplace that contrasted with the storm outside. "The documents that Robert gathered are now with the police, and the evidence against us is substantial." "How did we let this happen?" questioned Sandra, an elegant 50-year-old woman known for her coldness in business. "Mark assured us that he had everything under control." "Mark underestimated Robert," replied Helen, "and now we could all end up involved in this scandal." Edward, the youngest of the directors, seemed especially nervous. "We have to anticipate this. Admit that there were administrative problems, but deny direct involvement." "Denial won't work," retorted Richard, helping himself to more whiskey. "I've been through situations like this before. We need a scapegoat." "Mark," suggested Helen, without beating around the bush. "He coordinated the financial operations. We can claim that he acted on his own without our knowledge." Claire, who until then had listened to everything in silence, stood up indignantly. "You intend to throw my husband to the wolves after everything he did for the company, for you?" Helen approached her with a sympathetic expression, but her eyes were cold as ice. "Claire, darling, it's the only way out. Mark is hospitalized, weakened. The police already have evidence against him. If they keep us out of it, we can ensure that he has the best defense, the best resources." "And what do I gain from this?" asked Claire, wiping away her tears. "Financial security. We'll maintain your standard of living, obviously, and when everything calms down, who knows, an honorary position in the company for you." What no one had noticed was Guardian, the black stray dog, lying under the window of the room, sheltered from the rain and listening to every word of the conversation. When Helen concluded her proposal, the dog silently moved away into the darkness. The next morning, the front page of the Chicago Tribune featured the headline, "Scandal at Transam, $1 Million Fraud Exposed." The report, signed by investigative journalist Teresa Reed, detailed the scheme to divert resources, mentioning all those involved, including the directors who had met at Mark's house. "How did this leak so quickly?" asked Edward, desperate, calling Helen. "They have details of our conversation from last night." Helen, normally unshakable, felt the taste of fear for the first time. "I don't know, Edward. It seems we have an informant." At the hospital, Mark was receiving a visit from Detective Anderson. "Mr. Matthews, you are being formally charged with fraud, forgery of documents, and attempted bribery. As soon as you are discharged, you will be taken to the police station to give a formal statement." Mark, still pale and haggard, seemed to have aged years in a single day. "Detective, I didn't act alone. The entire board was involved." "We know that. We're investigating all those involved." "I want to cooperate. I can provide details, names, dates." The detective noted something in his notebook. "Why this change in attitude, Mr. Matthews?" Mark looked out the window where the rain was finally giving way, revealing a timid ray of sunshine. "That dog. He not only saved me, I think he saved my conscience too." At the police station, Robert was finally released after his innocence regarding the attempted assault was proven. In the courtyard, Sarah and Lucas were anxiously waiting for him. "Dad!" Lucas ran to hug him. "Everything's fine now," assured Robert, hugging his son and wife. "What happens now?" asked Sarah. "The investigation into the fraud at Transam will continue. I'll probably be called as a witness, but I'm free of any charges." As the family walked toward the car, a familiar bark caught their attention. Guardian was watching them from a distance, as if verifying that everything was all right. "Look, Dad." "It's Guardian," pointed Lucas. Robert smiled and walked slowly toward the animal, which, to everyone's surprise, didn't run away as it usually did. "Thank you, friend," said Robert, crouching down to be at the dog's height. "I don't know how, but you changed everything." Guardian just looked at him with those deep and intelligent eyes, as if understanding every word. Then, with one last look at the Silver family, he calmly walked away, disappearing among the parked cars. "This is no ordinary dog," commented Sarah, intrigued. "Indeed, it's not," agreed Robert, "and I think his mission isn't over yet." At the Chicago Tribune newsroom, Teresa Reed was writing the next chapter of the Transam saga when she noticed a black stray dog sitting patiently next to her desk. "Hello, little friend." "Lost?" she asked, surprised by the animal's presence in the building. Guardian just watched her as if waiting for something. Teresa noticed a small flash drive attached to the improvised collar that the animal was wearing. Teresa Reed looked at the flash drive attached to the dog's collar, hesitant about what to do. In her 15 years as an investigative journalist, she had never received information in such an unusual way. "Where did you come from?" she asked, as she crouched down to better examine the animal. Guardian remained seated, his eyes fixed on her, almost as if understanding the importance of the moment. Carefully, Teresa removed the flash drive from the improvised collar. "Charlie," she called to the technology editor who was passing through the corridor, "we need to check this urgently and very carefully." Charlie Oliver, a 45-year-old man, with astute eyes behind thick-framed glasses, took the device with interest. "Where did this come from?" Teresa pointed to the black dog. "Our friend here brought it. I believe it's related to the Transam case." Charlie raised his eyebrows, surprised. "A dog delivering evidence? This story gets stranger and stranger." "Let's see what we have here," said Teresa, following him to the computer room. While the journalists analyzed the content of the flash drive, Guardian remained in the reception area of the newspaper, as if standing guard. Employees who passed by looked curiously at the stray dog, some offering water or treats, which he politely accepted. In the temporary office that the police had set up for the Transam investigation, Detective Anderson was analyzing the testimonies collected so far. His assistant, young investigator Philip Sampson, entered the room with a folder. "Detective, you need to see this. These are the images from all the security cameras in the Transam area for the past 6 months. And what's interesting there? The dog, sir. He appears in several images, always nearby when meetings between the company directors take place. And even stranger, Sometimes he seems to be deliberately observing. The detective took the printed photos, analyzing them with growing interest. That's unusual. Are you sure it's the same animal? Absolutely. The white crescent-shaped marking on the chest is unique. Meanwhile, at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Helen was visiting Mark, who was about to be discharged. "The lawyers are already prepared," she said, sitting next to the bed. "We'll claim that you acted under pressure from the board of directors." Mark observed her with a different look, as if seeing her for the first time. "I won't lie anymore, Helen. I've already spoken to the detective. I'm going to fully cooperate with the investigations." The lawyer turned pale. "You what? Have you lost your mind? This will destroy us. All of us." "Maybe it's time to pay for our mistakes," he replied calmly. "That dog saved me for some reason. I can't live in this lie anymore." Helen stood up, furious. "That damn stray, since he appeared, everything began to crumble." At that moment, the door to the room opened and Claire entered, carrying a small suitcase with clothes for her husband. Her face showed that she had heard the conversation. "So it's true," she said with a trembling voice. "You were indeed involved in fraud." Helen tried to remedy the situation. "Claire, it's not exactly like that. And you plan to use my husband as a scapegoat. I heard everything last night, Helen. The meeting at my house." Mark looked confusedly at his wife. "How did you know?" "After everyone left, I found a recording on my cell phone. Someone remotely activated the recording function during the entire meeting. I thought it was you, Helen, trying to manipulate me, but now I see it wasn't." The three people in the room looked at each other, trying to understand the mystery. It was Mark who verbalized the thought they all shared. The dog. Somehow, it was that stray. At the Chicago Tribune newsroom, Teresa and Charlie were dumbfounded by the content of the flash drive. "This is unbelievable," whispered Teresa. "These are recordings of all the secret meetings of the Trans Am directors over the past few months. Details of how they diverted money, laundered capital through shell companies abroad, bribed inspectors. But how were these recordings made? And who could get access to all these private meetings?" questioned Charlie. Teresa looked out the window of the room and saw Guardian still sitting at the reception. "I think our friend over there has more to do with this than we imagine." Meanwhile, the investigation was advancing quickly. With the new evidence obtained through the mysterious recordings, the FBI was called in, and the main Trans Am directors began to be summoned to testify. Richard Turner was the first to break. After just 2 hours of interrogation, he decided to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. "It was all the idea of the former owner of the company, Andrew Smith," he confessed. "It started small, manipulating some bids. Then it grew into an international scheme." "And where is Andrew Smith now?" asked the detective. "Officially, retired on his farm in the countryside. But in reality, he still pulls all the strings. It was he who ordered us to silence Robert when we discovered he was investigating the scheme. At the Silver home, Robert was trying to return to normalcy. He had received several job offers after the story became public, but he was more concerned about the safety of his family. "Maybe we should take a vacation for a while," he suggested to Sarah. "Go to your sister's house in Boston until everything calms down." "Do you think we're in danger?" she asked, concerned. "I don't know. But a lot of powerful people are being implicated in this scandal. I'd rather not risk it." Lucas, who had been intensely researching over the past few days, entered the room with his laptop. "Dad, Mom, you need to see this. I found something." "It's about Guardian." The parents approached, curious. "What did you find, son?" 3 years ago, there was a mysterious fire at the old Trans Am headquarters. One person died, Paul Garrison, an accounting auditor who, according to rumors at the time, had discovered irregularities in the company. "And what does that have to do with Guardian?" asked Sarah. "Paul had a dog, a black Labrador called Atlas. In the photos, he has the same white mark on the chest as Guardian." Robert took the laptop to get a better look at the images. "That's impossible. Are you suggesting that Guardian was this auditor's dog?" "Not just that," continued Lucas. "Paul lived alone with the dog. On the day of the fire, Atlas was injured. Trying to save his owner, the firefighters rescued him, but he disappeared from the shelter where he was taken that same night." The three remained silent, processing the information. "Son, that's just a coincidence," argued Sarah. "We can't believe it's the same dog, and even if it were..." A familiar bark interrupted the conversation. Through the living room window, they saw Guardian sitting in the front yard observing them. "He followed us here?" asked Sarah, surprised. Robert opened the door and slowly approached the animal. "Atlas, is that your real name?" The dog slightly tilted his head, as if considering the question, and then approached, allowing Robert to pet him for the first time. "How is this possible?" murmured Robert. "What happened to you, friend?" Guardian or Atlas just looked at him with those deep and unsettlingly intelligent eyes. Then he turned and began to walk slowly down the street, stopping after a few meters as if inviting Robert to follow him. "He wants you to go with him, Dad," said Lucas, who was watching everything from the door. Robert hesitated for a moment, looking at Sarah and Lucas at the door of the house. "I'll go with him," he finally decided. "I think we need to find out where this story ends." "You're not going alone," said Lucas, already grabbing his jacket. "I'm coming with you." Sarah seemed apprehensive, but she knew her husband and son well enough to know it wouldn't be worth trying to dissuade them. "Be careful, and keep me informed." Guardian, or Atlas, as they now suspected was his real name, maintained a constant pace, always a few meters ahead of Robert and Lucas, occasionally looking back as if to make sure they were still following him. Night was falling over Chicago, and the first stars were beginning to dot the sky that had finally freed itself from the clouds. "Where do you think he's taking us?" asked Lucas, intrigued. "I have no idea, but I trust him," replied Robert, surprised by his own statement. How could he trust so blindly in a dog, however extraordinary it seemed? After about half an hour walking through increasingly less busy streets, they arrived at an old neighborhood in the north of the city. Guardian stopped in front of an abandoned house, partially destroyed by what seemed to have been a fire a long time ago. "Is this where Paul Garrison lived?" asked Robert, recognizing the address from Lucas's research. The young man quickly consulted his cell phone. "Yes, this is the place. It wasn't restored after the fire." Guardian barked once and advanced to the backyard, disappearing among the overgrown bushes. Robert and Lucas looked at each other before following the animal. In the back of the property was a small tool shed that had apparently escaped unscathed from the fire. Guardian scratched at the door, which was locked. "He wants us to enter there," commented Lucas. Robert examined the rusty lock. "It's locked, but maybe..." He picked up a stone and hit the lock hard several times until it gave way. The door opened with a ghostly creak, revealing a small and dusty space. "We need light," said Robert, turning on his cell phone flashlight. The beam of light revealed shelves with gardening tools, old paint cans, and at the back a small metal chest. Guardian barked again, pointing with his muzzle to the chest. "I think he wants us to see this," said Lucas, approaching. The chest wasn't locked. When they opened it, they found organized folders, an old notebook, and several storage devices. Inside the lid of the chest, glued to the inside, was a photo of Paul Garrison smiling next to Atlas, still a puppy. "My God," whispered Robert. "It really is the same dog." Lucas picked up one of the folders and began to leaf through the documents. "Dad, this is incredible. These are investigations that Paul was doing on Trans Am. They date from 3 years ago, but the schemes are basically the same ones you discovered." "So he already knew," murmured Robert, "and he was probably eliminated because of it." Guardian let out a low whimper, as if confirming the suspicion. His eyes seemed almost human in the dimness of the shed. Lucas turned on the notebook, hoping it would still work. "The battery is dead, but we can take it home and check." While they were collecting the material, they heard the sound of a car, abruptly stopping in front of the house, followed by hurried footsteps. "Is anyone here?" called a familiar voice. "Detective Anderson?" replied Robert, surprised. The detective appeared at the door of the shed, accompanied by 2 police officers. "Silver, what are you doing here?" Then he noticed the dog. "And I see that our mysterious friend is also present. How did you find us?" asked Lucas. "We received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity at this address, but I suspect it wasn't so anonymous after all," he said, looking at Guardian. "You won't believe this, but the call to the police station seemed to come from a dog barking." Normally we would ignore it, but with everything that's been happening. Robert quickly explained what they had discovered, showing the detective the documents they had found. Paul Garrison was investigating Trans Am 3 years ago when he died in that fire. And Guardian, or rather Atlas, was his dog. "That's impossible," murmured the detective, although his expression suggested that he was no longer so sure about what was impossible in this case. "Detective," called one of the police officers, "you need to see this." He extended a tablet with a news item that had just been published on the Chicago Tribune website. "Farmer Andrew Smith, former owner of Trans Am, found unconscious at his farm," said the headline. According to the report, security guards at the property found Smith collapsed in his office with signs of a heart attack. Beside him, a computer screen showed old emails that directly implicated him in the order to permanently silence auditor Paul Garrison. "It seems that our friend here has been busy," commented the detective, looking at Guardian, who remained impassive. "But how could a dog do all this?" questioned Lucas, perplexed. "Access computers, send emails, make recordings." Robert crouched down to look into the animal's eyes. "I don't know how to explain it, but I think he's not an ordinary dog. Paul must have been very special to him." Guardian approached and gently licked Robert's hand, as if in gratitude for the understanding. A week later, the FBI conference room in Chicago was packed with journalists. The Trans Am case had become national, with ramifications that reached high levels of government and large corporations. Robert, now considered a hero for his persistence in exposing the scheme, had been invited to the press conference. "Mr. Silver," asked a journalist, "how does it feel to be the man who brought down one of the largest corporate corruption schemes in the country?" Robert smiled modestly. "It wasn't just me. I had help from many people, and from a very special friend." The journalists exchanged confused looks, but Teresa Reed from the Chicago Tribune smiled discreetly. Meanwhile, at the Silver family farm in rural Illinois, Sarah was preparing Sunday lunch. They had decided to move there temporarily, seeking peace away from the media tumult that the case still provoked. Lucas was helping his father repair the pasture fence while they talked about the latest developments. "I still can't believe everything that happened," commented Lucas. "Do you think we'll ever know how Guardian did all that?" "Maybe some things don't need to be explained," replied Robert. "The important thing is that justice was done. Paul Garrison can rest in peace now." The investigation had confirmed that the fire at Paul's house was arson, ordered by Andrew Smith when he discovered that the auditor was about to report the fraud. Now Smith and the Trans Am directors were facing criminal charges, and the company had been completely restructured under new management. Mark Matthews, after fully cooperating with the investigations, had received a reduced sentence. Claire had filed for divorce and now worked at an NGO providing assistance to victims of corporate fraud. Helen and the other directors were awaiting trial. "What about Guardian?" asked Lucas. "Do you miss him?" Robert looked toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to set. "I do, but I think his mission was accomplished. He needed to move on." After all the evidence was collected and the culprits identified, Guardian simply disappeared. No one in the city saw him again, as if he had dissolved into the air after completing his mission of justice. "Look, Dad!" exclaimed Lucas suddenly, pointing to a nearby hill. At the top, silhouetted against the orange sky of dusk, was a medium-sized black dog watching them. Even at a distance, Robert recognized the white crescent-shaped mark on his chest. "It's him," whispered Lucas, emotional. The dog remained, motionless for a few moments, as if saying goodbye before turning and disappearing over the other side of the hill. "Where do you think he's going now?" asked Lucas, still looking at the spot where the animal had been. Robert smiled, feeling a strange mixture of peace and nostalgia. "Probably wherever he's needed. Perhaps there are other injustices to be corrected, other stories to be told." That night, around the dinner table, the Silver family toasted not only to the new life they were beginning, but also to the mysterious Guardian who had changed everything. Outside, a particularly bright star twinkled in the sky like a vigilant eye over the city. Years later, in a small town in upstate New York, An elderly couple was walking through the park when they noticed a black stray dog following a man in a suit who was carrying a suspicious briefcase. The animal had an unmistakable white crescent-shaped mark on its chest. "Look, dear," said the gentleman. "That dog reminds me of that incredible story that happened in Chicago, remember? The transportation company case?" "Oh, yes," replied the lady. "The famous dog that exposed the corrupt ones. What was his name again?" "Guardian," answered the man. "But they say his real name was Atlas." As they conversed, the dog turned his head in their direction as if he had heard. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and the couple felt an inexplicable shiver. Then, as mysteriously as he appeared, the dog returned his attention to the man in the suit and continued his silent vigilance. 5 years had passed since the events that shook Chicago and brought to light one of the largest corporate scandals in recent American history. Trans Am, now under new management and renamed Amerilog, had become a model of transparency and corporate ethics. The scars of the past were slowly healing, but the lessons remained alive in the memory of all those involved. On a sunny Sunday morning, Robert Silver, now compliance director at Amerilog, was having coffee on the porch of his new house in the Lakeview neighborhood with a view of Lake Michigan. At 47, his completely gray hair gave him a serene and wise appearance. Beside him, Sarah was leafing through a magazine while commenting on plans for the family lunch. "Did Lucas confirm he's coming with Megan? I need to know how many places." "To set at the table?" she asked, consulting her shopping list. "Yes, they'll arrive around noon, and I think they have some news to tell us," replied Robert with an enigmatic smile. Lucas, now 24 and recently graduated in investigative journalism, was following a path inspired by the experience he had lived years ago. He worked at the Chicago Tribune, alongside Teresa Reed, who had become his mentor. His girlfriend, Megan Cooper, was a veterinary student and shared with him a love for animals. The phone rang, interrupting Robert's thoughts. It was Teresa Reed. "Robert? Sorry to call on Sunday, but I thought you'd want to know. The prosecutor's office is finally going to close the Trans Am case. Andrew Smith accepted a plea deal and confirmed everything, including the involvement in the incident with Paul Garrison." Robert felt a shiver run down his spine. Even after so many years, the mention of that name still caused a mixture of sadness and reverence. "Thank you for letting me know, Teresa. It means a lot to me." After hanging up, he explained the news to Sarah, who squeezed his hand in silence. Both had learned that sometimes justice is slow, but it eventually arrives. Detective Thomas Anderson, now superintendent of the FBI in Illinois, had personally conducted the investigation to the end. The evidence delivered by Guardian, added to the confessions of those involved, had built a solid case that resulted in the conviction of all those responsible. Mark Matthews, after serving part of his reduced sentence for cooperation, now worked in a rehabilitation program for prisoners. The experience of almost having lost his life that day on the bridge had profoundly transformed him. In the afternoon, with the family gathered around the abundant table, Lucas announced that he and Megan were engaged. The celebration was joyful, with hugs, toasts, and plans for the future. When they were serving dessert, Lucas brought up another subject. "Dad, remember that project I mentioned? About making a documentary telling Guardian's story?" "Of course I remember," replied Robert. "Did you get approval?" "Better than that," said Lucas with an enthusiastic smile. "A producer from New York became interested. They want to turn the story into a streaming series. We've already signed the preliminary contract." Sarah clapped her hands, emotional. "That's wonderful, son. Your work being recognized nationally. And there's more," continued Lucas. "As part of the research for the documentary, we visited various animal shelters in the state. And in one of them in Evanston, we found something incredible." He signaled to Megan, who quickly left the room and returned, bringing a cardboard box with small sounds coming from inside. "We thought you might like to meet them," she said, carefully opening the box. Inside were 3 puppies, about 2 months old. They were black with small white crescent-shaped marks on their chests, exactly like Guardian. "My God," whispered Robert, unable to hide his emotion. "How is this possible?" The veterinarian at the shelter told us that an elderly lady appeared with them 3 weeks ago, explained Megan. She said she found an abandoned dog that had just given birth. The mother didn't survive, but she managed to save the puppies. The most incredible thing is that, according to the lady, there was a black stray dog that wouldn't leave the area, as if it were protecting the puppies until they were found. "Guardian," murmured Sarah with teary eyes. "We can't be sure of—" "Course," said Lucas, "but the coincidence is impressive. The mark on the chest is identical." Robert carefully picked up one of the puppies. The small animal looked at him with intelligent and curious eyes, so similar to Guardian's that it was impossible not to be moved. "We wanted to know if you'd like to adopt one of them," proposed Megan. "Megan and I will keep another, and the third has already been promised to Teresa." Robert looked at Sarah, who nodded without hesitation. "It would be an honor," he replied, as the puppy enthusiastically licked his hand. The following week, the small garden at the back of Robert and Sarah's house gained a blue-painted doghouse. The puppy, whom they named Hero, quickly adapted to the new family. He was smart, attentive, and demonstrated uncommon intelligence for his age. One afternoon, while Robert was working on his laptop on the porch, Hero began to bark insistently at the backyard. Intrigued, Robert got up to see what had caught the puppy's attention. At the back of the garden, standing like a statue under the shade of a tree, was a medium-sized black dog. Even at a distance, Robert immediately recognized the white crescent-shaped mark on his chest. "Guardian?" he called, hardly believing what he was seeing. The dog took a few steps forward, emerging from the shadow. He was older, with some white hairs on his muzzle, but still had the same penetrating and intelligent look. Hero ran to him, jumping joyfully around him. Guardian observed him with an almost paternal patience. Robert approached slowly, fearing that the animal would disappear as he had done so many times before. But Guardian remained where he was, allowing Robert to pet him for the first time in years. "Did you come to see your legacy?" asked Robert with a choked voice. "Or did you come to say goodbye?" In response, Guardian gently licked his hand and then moved away, walking toward the back gate. Before leaving, he turned one last time, as if wanting to engrave in his memory the image of Robert with little Hero. "Thank you for everything, friend," said Robert, understanding that this was indeed a farewell. "Rest now. Your work is done." Guardian slightly tilted his head, as if understanding, and then left, disappearing among the neighboring houses. Hero let out a long howl, like a salutation to his ancestor. The next day, the local newspaper carried a small note. "Paul Garrison, Justice, finally done. After 5 years of investigation, the case of the auditor who perished in a criminal fire is closed with the conviction of all those involved." On the same page, a small photo showed a black dog lying peacefully in front of the cemetery where Paul was buried. The caption simply said, "Mysterious visitor at the municipal cemetery. Staff report that the animal appeared at dawn and remained at the location until dusk." Robert cut out the news item and carefully stored it in a folder, where he kept all the reports about the case. On the cover, he wrote in his neat handwriting, "The Guardian of Truth." In the living room, framed on the wall, a new photo had been placed. The image of Hero next to the other 2 puppies, all wearing small blue bandanas with an embroidered inscription, "Sons of the Guardian." Below the photo, a discreet plaque with the words, "There are angels that walk on 4 paws, silent guardians of truth, who remind us that justice, however slow it may be, always finds its way." Meanwhile, in a small town in the countryside, an elderly black stray dog rested in the shade of a tree, attentively observing the children playing in the square. Perhaps his most important mission had been accomplished, but his vigilant eyes would never cease to watch over the innocent. Some legends never die. They just transform into new stories, ready to inspire the next generations. Dear listeners, we hope you have been moved by this conclusion to the saga of the Guardian. If this story about loyalty, justice, and the connection between humans and animals touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave your like on this video. Share in the comments. What was your favorite moment of this emotional journey? We have prepared a special playlist with equally inspiring stories that you can access by clicking to your left. Every day we bring content that explores the magic of the bonds that unite us and the lessons we can learn from our four-legged friends. Until the next story.